Welcome to Unheard Stories. Before we get started, I have just one question for you. Where are you all watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below because I'd love to know how far our little storytelling family is reaching. Globe showing Europe, Africa. Today's story is about love, betrayal, and the ultimate act of revenge. Imagine being in a relationship for over a decade, thinking you know someone inside and out, only to discover a secret that shatters everything you believed. That's exactly what happened to Eric, a successful architect living in bustling New York City. Eric thought he had it all: a thriving career, a beautiful wife named Sarah, and a future full of possibilities. But as we all know, life doesn't always go as planned. This tale begins on a chilly winter evening in 2023. The streets of New York were alive with the buzz of the holidays, but for Eric, it felt like the loneliest night of his life. He had flown in from Chicago, ready to surprise Sarah with a special anniversary dinner. He wanted to rekindle their spark, patch up the cracks that had been forming in their marriage. But instead he found himself standing outside a fancy Manhattan restaurant, questioning everything. Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It had started as a quiet suspicion. Sarah seemed distant lately, always on her phone or working late. Eric tried to ignore the signs, chalking it up to the stress of her demanding job as a marketing executive. But as the months went by, her excuses started to feel too rehearsed, too perfect. And then there was that name, Mark. Her new coworker. She talked about him just a little too much. Have you ever had that gut feeling that something was off? That nagging voice in the back of your mind you can't ignore? Eric felt it every time Sarah mentioned Mark. He tried to push it aside, reminding himself of their years together, the love they'd built. But tonight, as he stood outside that restaurant, everything would change. What Eric didn't know was that the events about to unfold would not only destroy his marriage but also set him on a path he never imagined. A path that would test his strength, his morality, and ultimately, his will to move forward. So, grab a seat and get comfortable because this is a story you won't want to miss. It's a tale of love lost, betrayal uncovered, and revenge served cold. Let's start at the beginning with Eric, Sarah, and a secret that would unravel their lives forever. Eric Johnson was the kind of man you'd describe as dependable. At 38, he was at the peak of his career as a renowned architect, his designs gracing the skylines of major cities. He had built a life that many would envy, but his proudest achievement was his marriage to Sarah, a woman he had met during their university days. Back then, she was a bright-eyed marketing student with dreams of climbing the corporate ladder, and Eric was a budding architect with a passion for design. They had clicked almost instantly, sharing a love for late-night conversations, quiet walks, and a shared dream of building a future together. Fast forward 12 years and things seemed perfect on the surface. Sarah, now 35, was a senior executive at a prestigious advertising firm, known for her wit and charm in the office. She had an effortless ability to light up a room, and Eric had always admired that about her. But over the years, the spark that had once defined their relationship had dimmed. The late-night conversations had turned into silent dinners, and their dreams of a shared future felt like distant memories. It wasn't that they didn't love each other anymore. At least that's what Eric told himself. Life had gotten busy, with demanding careers and the usual stresses that come with being a power couple in a bustling city like New York. But recently, Sarah had started to drift in ways Eric couldn't ignore. It was subtle at first: missed dinners, canceled plans, her phone always glued to her hand. Then there were the late-night work meetings and the trips to the gym that lasted longer than they should. Eric, ever the optimist, had tried to see the best in her. Maybe she was just stressed. Maybe she needed space. But then came Mark. Mark Richards was the new guy in Sarah's office. A hotshot creative director with a cocky grin and a reputation for being a charmer. Sarah mentioned him casually at first, describing him as talented and easy to work with. But as weeks turned into months, his name came up more frequently in their conversations. "Mark and I are working on a big project," she'd say. Or, "Mark has such great ideas. I think he's going to shake things up in the company." Eric tried not to overthink it, but the way she talked about Mark felt different. Too enthusiastic, too invested. Eric wasn't the jealous type, but something about Mark unsettled him. He noticed the way Sarah's face lit up when she mentioned him, the way she'd avoid making eye contact when Eric asked about her day. It was as if a wall had been quietly erected between them, and Mark was standing on the other side of it. Despite his growing doubts, Eric clung to the belief that their marriage could be saved. After all, they had been through rough patches before. He remembered the time Sarah had struggled with anxiety during a tough period at work, and he had been there to support her every step of the way. He thought about the sacrifices they had made for each other, the promises they had exchanged. Surely they could weather this storm too. But Sarah was changing in ways that made Eric question everything. She started going to the gym more frequently, spending hours perfecting her appearance. She bought new clothes, outfits that were far more daring than her usual professional wardrobe. When Eric complimented her, she'd smile faintly but wouldn't say much. It was as if her attention was elsewhere, her mind preoccupied with someone or something else. Eric's own routine had become predictable. He'd wake up early, go for a run, and head to his office, where he'd immerse himself in blueprints and project deadlines. He found solace in his work, pouring his energy into designs that would outlast him. But even his creative sanctuary couldn't shield him from the creeping unease that shadowed him everywhere he went. The more Eric observed Sarah, the more convinced he became that something wasn't right. He started noticing the little things, the way she'd glance at her phone and quickly put it away when he entered the room, the hushed conversations she'd have in the hallway, the way she avoided his touch. It was as if she was slipping away piece by piece and Eric didn't know how to stop it. One evening, as they sat in their living room, Eric decided to confront her. He kept his tone light, masking the storm brewing inside him. "You've been working a lot lately," he said. "Everything okay at the office?" Sarah barely looked up from her laptop. "Yeah, just the usual chaos. Mark and I are presenting to a big client next week, so it's been hectic." There it was again, Mark. Eric's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile. "You've mentioned him a lot lately. He must be pretty good at what he does." Sarah glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "He is. He's just easy to work with." "What? Are you jealous?" It was meant as a joke, but the way she said it felt like a challenge. Eric laughed it off, shaking his head. "Jealous? Nah. Just curious about the guy who's taking up so much of my wife's time." Sarah rolled her eyes, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You've got nothing to worry about, Eric. Mark's just a coworker." Her words were meant to reassure him, but they only deepened the pit in his stomach. Eric wanted to believe her, but his gut told him otherwise. And as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while Sarah slept beside him, he made a silent vow to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. Eric's suspicions didn't start with a grand revelation. Instead, it was the little things, subtle changes in Sarah's behavior that added up over time, forming a picture he couldn't ignore. Her once open demeanor became guarded, and her explanations for her late nights felt like rehearsed lines from a poorly written play. Eric began to feel like an outsider in his own marriage, a stranger to the woman he had built a life with. It was a Friday evening when the first undeniable crack appeared. Sarah had told him she'd be working late, again. She kissed him on the cheek before heading out, her perfume lingering in the air. Eric sat alone in their quiet apartment, staring at the dinner he had prepared for them. Something about the way she had smiled as she left, too cheerful for someone about to face a grueling work meeting, didn't sit right with him. As he cleaned up the untouched meal, a thought crept into his mind. What if she wasn't at work? The idea gnawed at him, refusing to let go. It was unlike Eric to invade someone's privacy, especially Sarah's, but desperation does strange things to a person. He picked up her tablet, which she often left lying around the house, and unlocked it with the password they both used for shared devices. He didn't know what he was looking for, emails, messages, anything. But as he opened her calendar app, his heart sank. There, in bold letters, was an entry for the evening. Dinner with Mark, 8 p.m. His hands trembled as he stared at the screen. Dinner with Mark? She had said she was working late. Eric tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a work dinner. Maybe it was innocent. But deep down he knew. He could feel it in his chest, a heavy weight pressing down on him. He couldn't sit still, not after seeing that. Grabbing his coat, he decided to see for himself. If he was wrong, he'd apologize and let it go. But if he was right, he hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of the restaurant listed in the calendar entry. The ride was silent except for the occasional honk of the busy New York traffic. Eric's mind raced, replaying every moment from the past few months, every odd behavior, every missed dinner, every mention of Mark. It was as if all the pieces were falling into place, painting a picture he didn't want to see. The restaurant was an upscale, intimate spot known for its romantic ambience. Eric had taken Sarah there for their anniversary once, years ago. The memory of that evening, her laughter, the way she had held his hand, stabbed at him as he stepped out of the cab. He hesitated for a moment, standing outside the glowing windows, unsure if he had the strength to face whatever he might find inside. Gathering his courage, Eric pushed open the door and stepped into the dimly lit restaurant. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the room, his eyes darting from table to table. And then he saw her. Sarah was sitting at a corner table, her face illuminated by the soft glow of candlelight. She looked radiant, her laughter ringing out as she leaned closer to the man across from her. Mark. He was just as Eric had imagined, confident, charming, and completely at ease. They looked like a couple straight out of a romantic movie, lost in their own world. Eric felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. He stood frozen, watching as Sarah reached across the table to touch Mark's hand, her smile warm and familiar. It was a smile Eric hadn't seen in months. And then, as if to seal his worst fears, Sarah leaned in and kissed Mark. It wasn't a quick, meaningless kiss. It was slow, intimate, the kind of kiss that spoke volumes about the connection they shared. Eric's vision blurred with tears, his chest tightening with a pain he couldn't describe. He wanted to march over to their table to demand an explanation, to scream at her for betraying him. But his feet wouldn't move. He felt paralyzed, as though the scene before him wasn't real, like he was watching someone else's life crumble to pieces. After what felt like an eternity, Eric turned and walked out of the restaurant, his body moving on autopilot. The cold winter air hit him like a slap in the face, but it did little to numb the agony tearing through him. He stumbled down the street, his mind racing, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. How could she do this to him? After everything they had been through, after all the years they had spent building a life together, how could she throw it all away? The questions circled endlessly in his mind, but there were no answers. Only the image of Sarah and Mark, laughing, kissing, living a lie that Eric had been too blind to see. He wandered the streets for hours, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his breath visible in the freezing air. He couldn't go home, not yet. The apartment they shared would only remind him of her, of the life they had built together, a life that was now in ruins. Eventually he found himself at a small, quiet bar, the kind of place where no one asked questions. He ordered a drink and sat in the corner, staring blankly at the glass in front of him. He felt hollow, as if everything that had made him who he was had been stripped away. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined, not just because of the affair, but because of the trust that had been shattered. For the first time in his life, Eric didn't know what to do. He had always been the steady one, the problem solver, the man with a plan. But now, faced with the reality of Sarah's betrayal, he felt lost. All he knew was that he couldn't stay silent. He couldn't pretend this wasn't happening. He had to confront her, to hear her explain why she had done this to him, even if it tore him apart. Eric didn't sleep that night. He paced their apartment, his thoughts consumed by the image of Sarah with Mark. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them together, her hand on his, her lips meeting his in a kiss that Eric once believed was only his. The betrayal cut deep, but as the hours dragged on, the pain began to shift. Anguish turned to anger, and anger gave way to resolve. If Sarah could betray him so easily, then she didn't deserve his trust, his love, or his silence. Eric decided he wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. He would confront her, but more than that, he would make her feel the same pain she had inflicted on him. Revenge wasn't in Eric's nature, but this wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclaiming his dignity, about showing Sarah that actions had consequences. The next morning, Eric was waiting in the kitchen when Sarah came home. She walked in wearing the same outfit she had left in the night before, her hair slightly tousled, a faint smile on her face that vanished the moment she saw him. Her eyes widened and she froze in the doorway, clutching her purse like it was a shield. "You're up early," she said, her voice forced and casual. "Didn't you sleep?" Eric didn't reply immediately. He let the silence hang between them, watching as her unease grew. Finally he spoke, his tone calm but cold. "I couldn't sleep. Too busy thinking about you and your dinner with Mark." Sarah's face went pale. For a moment she looked like a deer caught in headlights, but she quickly recovered, her expression shifting to one of confusion. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice defensive. "Don't lie to me, Sarah," Eric said, his voice sharp. I saw you with him at the restaurant last night." Her mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. Eric could see the panic in her eyes, the wheels turning as she tried to figure out what to say. He didn't give her the chance. "How long has it been going on?" he demanded. "How long have you been sneaking around behind my back, lying to my face, pretending everything was fine while you were with him?" Sarah's lips trembled, and for a moment, Eric thought she might deny it. But then her shoulders slumped and she let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Eric's anger flared. Didn't mean for what to happen? The lies? The betrayal? Or the affair itself? Sarah looked down, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know, she said quietly. I didn't plan this, Eric. It just happened. Don't you dare say it just happened, Eric snapped, his voice rising. Affairs don't just happen. They take effort, Sarah. They take time. Time you were supposed to be spending with me. Sarah flinched at his words, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I'm sorry, she repeated, her voice muffled. I never wanted to hurt you. Eric laughed bitterly. Well, congratulations. You did. But don't worry, Sarah. You're not going to get away with it. For the first time, Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with fear. What do you mean? Eric didn't answer. He grabbed his coat and walked out the door, leaving her sitting alone in the kitchen. He needed space to think, to plan. He wasn't going to let her off the hook, but he wasn't going to act impulsively either. If he was going to get revenge, it needed to be calculated, deliberate, and unforgettable. Over the next few days, Eric put his plan into motion. He started by gathering evidence. He went through Sarah's social media, her emails, her phone records, anything that could confirm what he already knew. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. Texts between Sarah and Mark, late-night phone calls, even photos of the two of them together. Each piece of evidence was like a dagger to his heart, but he didn't let it stop him. He saved everything, creating a folder on his laptop labeled The Truth. Eric also began reaching out to people. Sarah's friends, her coworkers, even her family. He didn't tell them everything, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. Have you noticed anything strange about Sarah lately? He'd ask. She's been acting distant and I'm worried about her. The responses were varied. Some expressed concern, others brushed it off, but Eric could see the wheels turning in their minds. He knew the truth would spread slowly but surely. The next step in Eric's plan was more personal. He decided to confront Mark directly. He waited outside Mark's office building one evening, watching as employees trickled out. When Mark finally appeared, Eric approached him, his heart pounding in his chest. Mark Richards, right? He said, his tone calm but firm. Mark looked surprised but nodded. Yeah, that's me. Do I know you? You know my wife, Eric said, his voice steady. Sarah. Mark's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly composed himself. All right, Sarah. She's mentioned you? Eric smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm sure she has. Listen, I just wanted to say thank you. Mark frowned. Thank me? For what? For showing me who my wife really is, Eric said, his voice laced with sarcasm. You've done me a favor, Mark. I just hope you're ready for what comes next. Before Mark could respond, Eric walked away, leaving him standing on the sidewalk, his expression a mix of confusion and unease. The final piece of Eric's plan involved Sarah's company. He knew she had been up for a promotion, a position she had been working toward for years. It was her dream job, one she had talked about endlessly. Eric also knew that her affair with Mark, who worked in the same office, could jeopardize her chances if it came to light. Eric made an anonymous tip to her HR department, providing the evidence he had gathered, text messages, photos, and timestamps that proved Sarah and Mark's relationship was more than professional. He knew it was a risky move, one that could backfire, but he didn't care. He wasn't just seeking revenge, he was dismantling the life Sarah had chosen to ruin. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Sarah came home one evening, her face pale, her hands trembling. They know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone told HR about me and Mark. Eric feigned surprise. Really? That's awful. I wonder who could have done that. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but Eric felt no sympathy. She had made her bed and now she had to lie in it. Eric's revenge wasn't just about hurting Sarah. It was about reclaiming his power, his self-worth, and his life. He had been a victim of her betrayal, but he refused to let it define him. By exposing the truth and taking control of the narrative, Eric began to rebuild himself, piece by piece. The confrontation with Sarah, the conversation with Mark, and the tip to HR were all calculated steps in a plan that left no room for doubt. Sarah's affair had cost her more than just her marriage, it had cost her her reputation, her career, and the respect of those around her. And while Eric didn't revel in her downfall, he found a sense of closure in knowing that justice had been served. Eric had always been a man of precision and patience, traits that had served him well in his career as an architect. Now, those qualities were his greatest allies as he set out to execute the plan he had carefully crafted over the past few weeks. The pain of Sarah's betrayal burned inside him, but he refused to let it cloud his judgment. This wasn't about anger or spite, it was about justice, about reclaiming control over his life and ensuring that Sarah faced the consequences of her choices. The first step was ensuring that Sarah's affair with Mark couldn't be hidden. Eric had gathered all the evidence he needed: text messages, photographs, and even a detailed timeline of their meetings. But simply confronting Sarah wasn't enough. She needed to face accountability beyond their personal relationship. Eric decided to focus on two key areas: her career and her social circle. Sarah's advertising firm prided itself on maintaining a strict code of conduct. Relationships between colleagues, especially those in positions of power, were heavily discouraged. Eric knew this because Sarah had often complained about the company's policies, jokingly calling them relationship police. Now those policies would work against her. Using an anonymous email, Eric sent the evidence of Sarah and Mark's affair to the firm's HR department. He kept the tone professional, stating that he was concerned about a potential conflict of interest and a breach of workplace ethics. Alongside the email, he attached the most incriminating photographs and excerpts from their text messages, leaving little room for doubt. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Within a week, Sarah and Mark were called into separate meetings with HR. The evidence was undeniable, and both were suspended while the company conducted an investigation. Word of the scandal spread quickly, and Sarah found herself at the center of office gossip. Colleagues she had once considered allies now kept their distance, wary of being associated with the drama. For Sarah, the humiliation was unbearable. She tried to keep her head down, but the whispers and judgmental glances followed her everywhere. Mark, on the other hand, responded with anger, accusing Sarah of dragging him into a mess that had jeopardized his career. Their once exciting affair quickly turned sour as the stress and pressure took their toll. While the professional consequences played out, Eric turned his attention to Sarah's social circle. Over the years, Sarah had cultivated an image of being the perfect wife, the successful executive, and the life of the party. She loved hosting dinners and attending events, always presenting herself as poised and charming. Eric knew that exposing her betrayal to her friends would strike a blow to the persona she had worked so hard to maintain. He started with their closest mutual friends, inviting them over for drinks one evening. Eric was careful not to come across as bitter or vindictive. He wanted to present the facts and let them draw their own conclusions. As they sat in his living room, he laid out the evidence, explaining how he had discovered Sarah's affair and why he felt it was important for them to know the truth. The reaction was a mix of shock, anger, and sympathy. Some friends expressed disbelief, unable to reconcile the Sarah they knew with the person who had been leading a double life. Others were furious on Eric's behalf, condemning Sarah's actions as selfish and cruel. By the end of the night, the group was united in their support for Eric, vowing to distance themselves from Sarah and Mark. Word spread quickly within their social circle. Sarah found herself uninvited from gatherings and ostracized by people she had considered close friends. The realization that her actions had cost her not only her marriage but also her social standing hit her hard. Eric could have stopped there, but he felt there was one more thing he needed to do. Sarah had built her life on appearances, and Eric wanted her to confront the reality of her choices in the most public way possible. He decided to host a dinner party, a gathering of their mutual friends, colleagues, and even a few of Sarah's family members. Sarah, of course, wasn't invited. At the party, Eric kept the atmosphere light and casual, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. Everyone in attendance knew the truth about Sarah's betrayal, and her absence was glaring. Toward the end of the evening, Eric raised a toast, thanking his friends and family for their support during a difficult time. "I've learned a lot about resilience and the importance of honesty," he said, his voice steady. "Sometimes the people you trust the most turn out to be the ones who hurt you the deepest. But moving forward, I'm choosing to surround myself with people who value loyalty and integrity." The toast was met with a mix of applause and knowing glances. Eric's words weren't just a message to the room, they were a declaration of his freedom from the pain Sarah had caused. It was a symbolic moment, one that marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life. The consequences of Eric's actions rippled through Sarah's life in ways she hadn't anticipated. With her suspension at work turning into a termination, she struggled to find a new job. Her reputation in the industry had been tarnished, and potential employers were hesitant to take a chance on her. Mark, too, faced difficulties, eventually leaving the city to escape the stigma. Sarah tried to repair her relationships with friends and family, but the damage was done. Many of them viewed her actions as a betrayal not just of Eric, but of the trust they had placed in her. She became increasingly isolated, forced to confront the fallout of her decisions alone. Meanwhile, Eric began rebuilding his life. He focused on his work, channeling his energy into designing projects that brought him a sense of pride and accomplishment. He reconnected with old friends, traveled to places he had always wanted to visit, and even started dating again, though he took things slow. Through therapy, Eric learned to process his emotions and let go of the anger that had consumed him. Revenge had given him a sense of closure, but it was his own strength and resilience that ultimately helped him move forward. By the time Sarah reached out to him months later, apologizing and asking for another chance, Eric was no longer the man she had betrayed. He declined her request, knowing that his future lay ahead, not in the past. The months following Sarah's departure were a whirlwind of change for Eric. The weight of betrayal and heartbreak lingered, but it was accompanied by a growing sense of relief that the lies and deceit were finally behind him. For the first time in years, he had the space to reflect on his life and decide what he wanted moving forward. The first thing Eric did was immerse himself in his work. Architecture had always been his passion, and now it became his sanctuary. He took on challenging projects, often staying late at the office not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Designing intricate structures allowed him to channel his emotions into something tangible, something beautiful. His colleagues noticed the change in him. Eric seemed sharper, more focused, and more driven than ever before. But work wasn't the only area of Eric's life that saw transformation. He began rebuilding his social connections, reaching out to friends he hadn't seen in years. Some of these relationships had faded during his marriage, largely due to Sarah's tendency to monopolize their time. Now, Eric found himself rediscovering old friendships, laughing over beers at a local pub, and reminiscing about the past. These moments reminded him that his life wasn't defined by Sarah's betrayal, it was so much bigger than that. Despite the progress he was making, Eric knew he couldn't heal on his own. The scars left by Sarah's infidelity ran deep, and he needed to address them head-on. With some encouragement from a close friend, Eric started seeing a therapist, a decision that would prove to be one of the most impactful of his life. In therapy, Eric unpacked the complex emotions he had been carrying. He confronted his anger, sadness, and feelings of inadequacy, learning to separate his worth from Sarah's actions. He came to understand that her betrayal wasn't a reflection of his failures as a husband, but of her own choices and shortcomings. This realization was liberating, allowing him to let go of the guilt that had weighed on him. One of the hardest moments in therapy came when Eric was asked to revisit the good memories of his marriage. At first, he resisted, unwilling to acknowledge the love and happiness they had once shared. But over time he realized that holding on to bitterness only prolonged his pain. By acknowledging the positive moments, he was able to put them in their proper place, as part of a chapter that had ended, but one that didn't define the rest of his story. As the months turned into a year, Eric began to feel like himself again, only stronger, more self-assured, and more at peace. He moved out of the apartment he had shared with Sarah, finding a new place that felt like a fresh start. It was a cozy loft with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. The space was modern and minimalistic, a reflection of the clarity he now felt in his life. Eric also started exploring new hobbies. He took up photography, capturing the beauty of the city that had once felt so suffocating. On weekends he'd take long walks through Central Park or visit art galleries, finding inspiration in the creativity of others. These small acts of self-discovery reminded him of who he was outside of his marriage, a man with passions, dreams, and a desire to embrace life fully. It was a cold autumn evening when Sarah reached out to Eric for the first time since their divorce had been finalized. He was sitting in his loft, sipping a cup of coffee and flipping through a photography book, when his phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. The words were brief but unmistakably hers. "I'm sorry for everything. Can we talk?" Eric stared at the message for a long moment, his mind racing. A year ago he might have jumped at the opportunity, desperate for closure or some kind of reconciliation. But now he felt differently. He didn't need an apology to validate his feelings or to move on. He had already done the work to heal. Still, he felt it was important to hear her out, if only to put the final nail in the coffin of their shared past. They met at a quiet cafe downtown, a place they had once frequented during happier times. Sarah looked different. Her once confident demeanor had been replaced by an air of sadness and regret. She fidgeted with her coffee cup as she spoke, apologizing for the pain she had caused and explaining how much she had lost in the aftermath of her actions. Her voice cracked as she admitted that she had been selfish, letting her insecurities and temptations destroy the life they had built together. Eric listened quietly, letting her say everything she needed to say. When she finished, he nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "I appreciate your apology," he said, his voice steady. "But I've moved on, Sarah. What we had is over, and I've made peace with that." The conversation ended amicably with no tears or raised voices, just two people acknowledging the end of a chapter. As Eric walked away from the cafe, he felt a sense of finality wash over him. For the first time in years he felt truly free. Eric's life continued to flourish in the months that followed. His career reached new heights, with one of his designs winning a prestigious architectural award. He traveled to Europe, exploring cities like Paris and Rome, where he found inspiration in the centuries-old structures that told stories of resilience and reinvention. Eventually, Eric began to open himself up to the idea of love again. He met someone new, Mia, a freelance writer with a quick wit and an adventurous spirit. Their relationship was built on honesty and mutual respect, a stark contrast to the lies and deceit he had endured before. With Mia, Eric felt a renewed sense of hope, a reminder that even after heartbreak, love was still possible. As Eric reflected on his journey, he realized that Sarah's betrayal, while devastating, had been a turning point in his life. It had forced him to confront his vulnerabilities, reevaluate his priorities, and rediscover his sense of self. He had been broken, but he had rebuilt himself stronger than ever. For anyone listening to his story, Eric had one piece of advice: don't let someone else's actions define your worth. You're stronger than you think, and life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. And with that, Eric turned the page on the past, ready to embrace whatever the future had in store. And that's the end of Eric's story, a tale of heartbreak, betrayal, and ultimately redemption. Life doesn't always go the way we plan, but as Eric showed us, even in the darkest moments, there's a chance to rebuild and start anew. So, what did you think of today's story? Have you ever experienced or heard about something similar? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to tell me where you're tuning in from. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Unheard Stories for more shocking tales of betrayal, love, and resilience. Turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss an update. Trust me, the stories coming up will leave you speechless. Remember, life is full of unexpected twists and turns, and every story has something to teach us. Until next time, stay strong, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.